All right, man. For the sake of taking a scientific interview into the realm of philosophy right off the bat, what does uh, what does strength mean to you, physically, mentally, and why is it so important?
Yeah, so I mean, physically, strength it can be defined in many ways. You have muscular strength, right, endurance, and then you have absolute strength, which is what I really care about. How much can you actually push, pick up, put down? Um, and then from a muscular endurance perspective, you have your ability to just keep going, right, as many reps as possible. Um, but for me, because I have such a huge interest in strength, I want to know why we get stronger and how we get stronger, right? What's really applying to that. And so, from a physical perspective, it's really just pushing as much weight as you possibly can, right, without injuring yourself, of course. Um, but from a mental perspective, you have this ability to essentially push past your limits, right? Really dig deep. One of my favorite things to look at or watch is like MMA fights, or when they're getting to the championship rounds. You can see they're starting to slow down, their breathing's heavy, and they have to dig in deep and really, really try to like push through. And sometimes, they pull off an upset or land a KO, and it's awesome. And sometimes you can see where they are mentally if they can escape. I like to take the quote that Khabib said to I forgot who was being interviewed by, but he basically wanted to tell people that he brings people in the deep depths and makes them realize who they really are, right? Those hardships of really digging deep.
Yeah, yeah, I remember that they were interviewing him, and they were asking about like, oh, this person knocks this person out, this person does submissions. Like, what do you do? And he's like, I take them to the deep and see what they really want, what they're really made of. And yeah, that I think that defines mental strength about as clear as anything can, right?
Oh, for sure.
But with the idea of like strength being the target of your research and what you've dedicated the last 10 years of both practically of your own lifting career and then also within the lab within the research that you do. Um, what exactly does it mean to live a life that is defined by strength being the priority? Like what does that look like? What does that shape a person into? And is it something that people should look to strive for?
Yeah, actually, it's funny enough. I rewatched one of my favorite animes called Hajime no Ippo, and it's about this kid in high school who got bullied, and he comes across this boxer and sees this boxer do some like crazy stuff, right? Defends him and everything. And so he asks him, like, what does it mean to be strong? And so he embarks on this journey of becoming a boxer and makes it all the way to, rookie championships, and then eventually wins the Japanese title. And he's always asking himself, like, what does it mean to be strong? And so he's always striving for that next, you know, challenge, right? Never backing away from a challenge. And so for me, researching strength, it's yeah, sure, pushing past your limits and lifting a heavy single, but also being willing to take the necessary steps to be the best, right? I think we all undergo challenges, and sometimes they break us down mentally and physically. For instance, during my last fall, during my dissertation, was probably the darkest I've ever felt in my life, where I was up at 4:30 until 7 p.m. collecting data, teaching classes, writing papers, just in the weeds of what a PhD field is supposed to be like. And when it's done and you finish, and they hand you the diploma and you publish your dissertation, you can like breathe, and then you're like, wow, like that shaped me, and that was hard, and I'm glad I endured that, because now whatever challenges come my way, I'm used to it. So now the question is, like, how do I progress from there? And so now the challenge is from being a PhD student to now being a faculty member, and then mentoring students. That's a challenge in of its own, and it's a fun challenge for me. But the willingness to keep improving, I think, really is what challenges me to be stronger, both mentally and from a physical perspective. Uh, I was in the worst shape of my life last fall, and now I'm getting back into the group of things and hitting the weights I want to hit, and feeling a lot more uh, comfortable in the gym as opposed to last year, where every time I saw a plate, I was just like, I don't want to do anything with that. I'm done with it.
Yeah. Yeah. What did it feel like when you were finished with your data collection and you did receive that PhD? Did it feel like what you made it out to be, or was it something where you got it and you're like, "Huh, I thought it would be a little bit different"?
Yeah, great question. So when I was done, it was like this weird. I remember talking to Dr. Baker, and she said, like, it's a weird transition because, like, you're done. And that's just the beginning, right? Like, you feel like this was like the capstone of what it was to do a PhD, and you finish your dissertation and you can breathe. And then you finish and, you get your PhD, and then you're like, okay, like, I can do this. Like, I want to go more, do more. I want to ask bigger questions, do harder studies, publish bigger papers, Um, but I think from a personal perspective, the fact that I was like a first generation American, like Mexican American, like no one in my family's ever gone to college. And then for me to like get 3 degrees and then, Atlanta, an assistant professorship here, Christopher Newport, uh, I'm just super happy. But it's also kind of surreal because like, I'm just like, it, deep down, I'm just a dude, you know? I don't consider myself special by any means. I just love research. I love learning about how the body works and more importantly, what makes us stronger. And um, I think that keeps me humble, especially when you're surrounded by very smart people all the time, and you think you know something. I think it's called like the Kruger effect, right? When you think you're like an expert in a field and you meet someone that actually knows what they're talking about, you're like, whoa, I know nothing. Um, so yeah, even though I have a PhD, I'm still learning. I don't consider myself an expert by any means, and I hope to keep learning. And I think that's the beauty of getting the PhD is you obviously love science or some manner of that form, and you're just a forever student, which I'm comfortable being.
Yeah, there is this beauty of being humbled as often as you can be, right? Like one of the things I love about jujitsu is, no matter what day you go into roll, there's always going to be somebody there that's going to humble you that day, and you have the opportunity to learn from it, and try to get better, or you have the opportunity to cower in defeat and never go back to that class again. And you'll see people, and I'm sure you've seen people through grad programs, and you'll see people as you teach and mentor, like you'll see the ones that find that humbling experience as something that they cherish and they lean into, and others are more looking for being that big fish in a small pond, and trying not to be the smartest person in the room and let everyone know they're the smartest person in the room. And is that something that you've always done? Like, is that something that's always kind of defined you, is trying to find the challenge, trying to find people that are smarter than you, as opposed to, trying to go places where you're the lead, you're the smartest person there?
Yeah, no, I'm not a fan of the idea that you have to flex, right? Being the smartest person. I feel like if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room,
Yeah.
right? I'm all about learning. And I mean, when we first met, it was a really cool experience because I think one of our first conversations was about training, right? And we went down this rabbit hole, and I came out of that conversation of just like, I thought I knew a lot,
Yeah.
right? And even like for such a small amount of time, I learned a lot from that just small conversation. And I think what's always been helpful for me is knowing that I want to be surrounded by people that know more than me. I don't like the idea of being the smartest person in the room because I can't grow from that
Yeah.
experience. And it's funny enough, you mentioned jujitsu and being humbled. I think wrestling was probably one of those things that really motivated me to want to be the best, but also know that like there's always going to be someone better than you, right? You beat the top person in the region, and then you go up to states, and you lose in the first round because that person was just wrestling for a longer period of time than you. And um, in the realm of research, it's funny. I remember being a master's student and reading a paper, and I was like, "Oh, I can break, man. Their methods are crap. This is a bad study." Yada yada, like bashing them on the internet. And then looking back, I was like, "Man, I was so immature and naive," because you can always do a study better,
Yeah.
right? And I think one of the biggest limitations in studies are like you can't do the perfect study, right? But you can learn from that study how to do a better study, right? So yeah, and during my PhD, having people like Dr. Jason DeFreitas and Michael Trevino, who are just so on it and witty and just can piece things together. Super fun, fascinating to listen to them talk. I rather listen
Yeah.
than talk the whole time.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that. You learn so much more from listening than trying to interject. It's better to say things with a purpose than to try to say things to fill empty space. Is the way that I always look at it. So getting into training and your research and the science of training, um, one of the things I want to talk to about is the idea of um, training adaptations. Right, we have acute adaptations, we have chronic
Hmm.
adaptations. Like um, kind of go into the weeds a little bit about the mechanisms of training, right? Specifically, strength and hypertrophy, and what are some of the adaptations that we're looking for from a neuromuscular perspective as well, because that's what your research is on.
Yeah, so it's common belief that the early adaptations that someone experiences with resistance training is due to neural, right? What those neural adaptations could be a multitude of things. I think the more common things are increase in cortical excitability. What that means is essentially from the motor cortex, our brain, transcending or sending signals from our brain down to our muscles that the signal gets stronger, right? Better connections, the synapses increase. You have an increase in potential increase in motor unit firing rate. So the motor unit is the alpha motor neuron that's located in the spinal cord, and it's uh, axons are essentially branching out and synapsing with specific fibers in our muscles, and they innervates those fibers to essentially contract. And so the idea is that with resistance training or some form of training, that the muscles essentially contract faster. Those impulses, action potentials increase. Um, there is a reduction in coactivation, which is basically the agonist muscle, which is the muscle that contracts, and the antagonist, which is the one that opposes. Um, there is a reduction in the amount of muscle excitation or activity that occurs between the two, meaning that there's more activation for the agonist and less for the antagonist, which allows you to produce more force, right? And essentially, they're counterposing each other. Um, there's a one something I found in one of my studies recently is a reduction in overall muscle excitation when you do something at an absolute load. So something that seems easier should, in theory, require less excitation, right? Less input, and we were able to actually support that notion in such a short amount of time. I mean, there's also more of the neurotransmitter side of things, right? We have what's known as neuromodulation. You can have an increase in serotonin, norepinephrine, which can excite the lower threshold motor units to be a little more excitable, right? So they're more likely to be activated earlier. Not only that, but sustain activation. Um, so those are kind of the bigger ones, at least the ones I'm more familiar with.
Yeah, and that's specifically when we're thinking about neuromuscular adaptations to strength training.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
So within that dynamic, right? When you understand those type of things, with the coactivation, with the decrease of the antagonists, with the excitability, you went into your research thinking, what about a muscle and its properties, and then after research, you came out with a different concept of what that is, or did your research kind of solidify what you already knew going into it?
Yeah, so originally my thought process is so kind of a little backtrack here. Um, we there's an assumption that a bigger muscle should be able to produce more force, right? So someone who's bigger should, in theory, be stronger. And so there's a group out of Olmos, I believe, um, Lineke's group. I believe your previous advisor, Sam Buckner, was underneath him as well. They propose the idea that you can get stronger without necessarily getting bigger, and that the fact that you lift weights, the hypertrophy that occurs, is kind of a byproduct of that, right? So my thought process going into my dissertation was that if the muscle doesn't get bigger, but you're getting stronger, what's actually contributing to that, right? So I designed a study where we had a group that focuses on getting stronger. So they did heavy singles with the leg press, 3 sets of 1 rep at 90%. And then another group that was focusing on getting bigger and stronger. So they did the exact same thing as the other group, the strength group, but then they had 3 additional sets at a lower intensity or lower load for as many reps as possible, right? The whole goal was for them to hypertrophy and get stronger. And so my thought process is, all right, from a neural perspective, are the adaptations that occur similar, right? Is it a training? Is it influenced by training, or is it influenced by morphological changes? And so after the study, we found that both groups actually increase in strength similarly, despite one group being significantly bigger, right? Hypertrophy more. But the neuromuscular adaptations were different. So, for instance, the strength group, they didn't experience as much hypertrophy as the strength hypertrophy group. But we found that they actually had an increase in the firing rates, motor unit firing rates, especially for those for the lower threshold motor units, without seeing a change in the size of the motor units, which is cool, right? That's kind of like, okay, that makes sense. If the muscle isn't getting bigger, then it has to compensate for the increase in force some other way. And so it was more of a change in the firing rates. The hypertrophy group actually had an opposite response where they actually had an increase in the motor unit size. So the fibers got bigger, and so they have bigger twitch forces. And because they have bigger twitch forces, they actually require less excitation to match force, if that makes sense. And so because they have bigger fibers, they actually saw a decrease in the firing rates. So they didn't have to fire as often because every time it did, it produced a significant amount of force, right, to compensate for the increase in force. And so that was kind of one of those things where people, in theory, thought like that makes sense, but no one actually tested that. And so it was cool to see the findings in my study where, yeah, sure enough, if someone doesn't get bigger, then the response is probably going to be to increase some type of neural involvement, right? And if someone does get bigger, then they probably don't need as much neural involvement because the muscle itself can compensate for that now that it's stronger and bigger, which is super exciting for me because I'm like, oh, cool. Like, I guess this kind of shows further support that the way we produce force and the way that we train, right, the specific adaptations are going to be tailored to the way we actually train.
Yeah. So with that in mind, then, one, why wouldn't they? And correct me if I'm wrong, but if they're more efficient at the movement, which means they're using less motor unit firing rates, why don't you think they were able to tap into that same threshold output that the other group did? And is that something that they would develop over time? So therefore, the idea that a bigger muscle would become a stronger muscle with enough time to be able to tap into those firing rates and to the action potentials.
Yeah, potentially, right? The problem is it was such a short study. So it was 6 weeks, 16 training sessions, right? All in untrained individuals. And so it could be that they were so used to training at low loads, right? So they became very efficient, right? Of doing something that's relatively easy. And so the way we actually examine motor unit behavior is we have them trace a trapezoid shape. I'm gonna do it backwards. There we go. So they relax, they increase force linearly, they maintain that, and then they slowly come down and then they relax, right? And while they're doing that, we have these sensors electromyography sensors that we place over the muscle, and we can actually see the muscle activation. And then as it's being recorded while they're producing force, we can actually decompose that signal into the individual motor units. So when they were recruited, and then their firing rates, right? What I think may have happened is because the hypertrophy group, they did so much low load exercise, right? High reps, low load, that a single contraction wasn't enough to really tap into everything. Right. So they didn't need as much excitation because they got adjusted to it. So a single rep is whatever. But the strength group, because they only did singles, they probably still needed a lot, if not the same amount of excitation to complete the same task that they did before training. Right. So potentially, if we did and we actually did do a test for this where they did as many reps as possible, it could be that after, right, when they're getting closer to failure, that they probably did see an increase. The hypertrophy group, sorry, had an increase in firing rates. But their method of essentially matching force, right, or torque is to rely on just recruiting bigger motor units because they just can produce more force. In the long run, there are a couple of studies now that show that when compared to untrained individuals, chronically trained individuals actually have the same firing rate behavior as an untrained individual. And the reason being is that they just have larger motor units, right? So they rely on just bigger twitch forces. So they don't have to rely on increasing the firing rates because it's not necessary. The fiber itself, the muscle fibers themselves are just big enough to produce enough force to match whatever task they need to do.
Okay.
So I, it's kind of tough because I do have a colleague, Stephanie Sontag, who's a PhD at LSU right now. Her dissertation actually did a yoga intervention in recreationally active individuals. And so she actually found that despite people already being somewhat trained, going under the or under doing a yoga intervention actually increased the firing rates for the lower threshold audience. So potentially, it could be that a novel stimulus without a change in muscle size may once again cause an increase in the firing rates because she saw no change in the muscle size after the intervention, but I
Right.
did, right? So I think it's kind of just like, okay, so the change in firing rates or the increase in firing rates is likely due to the lack of change in muscle morphology, but an increase in strength, right? So something has to essentially modulate that force. And if it's not a bigger muscle with larger motor units, then those motor units have to fire more, especially the lower threshold ones.
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, one of the ways we can create adaptations through a training environment is the novelty of exercise, right? And um, a lot of people with the untrained population think that those nervous system adaptations occur within the first 6 weeks. Correct? Is that
Yeah, 4 to 6 weeks. Typically, you see that hypertrophy is statistically like visible and significant after 4 to 6 weeks. So Moritani, which is kind of the first study to showcase this, is like the first 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks is neural adaptations, and anything greater than that is probably hypertrophy related.
okay? So the idea would be that maybe the novel training stimulus could be something that could potentially occur at like that 4 to 6 week range, and then maybe that would be a good time to think about creating another novel stimulus, whether it be through exercise selection or changing the volume or the intensity, or what do you think about the idea that how often do you need to introduce a novel stimulus to continue to get those training adaptations to occur? But also, we want to make sure that the training is specific enough to where we get good at the exercises that we are doing. So, where's that kind of like sweet spot? Do you think? What does the research show anything like that? Or
Yeah, funny enough, we don't have any studies that have actually done that, right? So I do think that the neural adaptations, in my personal opinion, and the neural adaptations probably don't play that big of a role in the long run. right? Even if you incorporate a novel stimulus, you're really only focusing on improving that stimulus or that activity in itself, right? So I think that if you want to get better at doing heavy singles, let's say you're a power lifter, if you want to be better at being a power lifter, then you probably want to be training closer to a higher load, right? Something that's very similar to what you're going to be doing in competition. Um, Now, off season, then yeah, you can apply some type of novel stimulus or different training method, but I think that ultimately you just get better at what you do,
Mhm.
right? I don't know there's necessarily a sweet spot when you need to transition to something else, but there's no study that's actually been able to like showcase how frequent these neural adaptations occur within a training, cycle, right?
Yeah.
So it's so tough to do training studies. That's why I laugh when people bash training studies. I'm like, then you do one.
Right.
They're never long enough. Well, it's so hard to just keep people consistently trained or training.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
when you think about it, right, like one of the limitations we have as researchers is we are confined and constricted by the semester and the schedules of the students or the participants of the study, right? So if you're doing a study in the fall, you have to contend with the fall break, the winter break, midterms, finals, things like that, that could increase dropout rate, increase the longevity of the intervention, right? So you're constantly trying to find this idea of like, what is the longest intervention that I can create within the paradigm of you only have 2 years to do your dissertation as well, right? And it has to fit within the semester so that kids aren't leaving to go home for the winter and then coming back, because then that's obviously not going to be a training intervention anymore, right?
mhm.
So it's like, yeah, do we want longer training studies? Yeah, of course. Is that actually ever going to be feasible within the confines of academia? Like, no, absolutely not. So we have to make do with what we can, and the best thing we can do is to try to create these training interventions that answer the specific question. Which for you, it gave you the answers you were looking for, um, and then understand that like, hey, like that is always going to be a limitation because the perfect one does not exist. But in terms of that, like what is the longest intervention study that we've done looking at motor unit adaptations and neuromuscular adaptations to date? And what do those show that potentially might be different than what you found? Are there any contrarian ideas of this motor unit neuromuscular adaptation?
Yeah. There, so in the motor unit realm, I think the average study length is anywhere between 6 to 8 weeks, least recent ones. And so Sarzala, he did a study 8 weeks in untrained individuals. He had a control group and his training group, and they did kind of a more standardized, like traditional training program, linear periodization. Right, they start off with like 65% and worked their way up to 85%, and they basically found the same thing I found with my hypertrophy group, except my hypertrophy group actually saw a decrease in the firing rates. They saw no change in the firing rates. Um, it could be that it probably a duration of the study, but I think we had the same amount of training visits between the two of us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but they kind of support what I was trying to say, where if someone gets bigger and they got stronger, then most likely the neural adaptation is that the motor units themselves just got bigger, right? There is a study by Rupo et al. Out of Mike Roberts' labs at Auburn, and it was a collaboration between Auburn and Central University of Central Florida, and they found they compared two training protocols: training to failure and being 5 reps in reserve. And they found that the group that trained closer to failure actually saw an increase in the y-intercept, suggesting that the lower threshold motor units increase in firing rates. Um, Both groups increase similarly between muscle size, but it's kind of interesting that the group that trained closer to failure saw an increase in the firing rates. So there's kind of equivocal findings when it comes to motor unit firing rates, but I still think the majority of the um, changes that we see neuromuscularly are probably due to changes in muscle size, right? So if the muscle gets bigger, then there's probably going to be less excitation necessary, right, to complete a single contraction, which is typically what we do to assess motor units.
Mhm.
Um, and then there are some other studies that they've done overseas in Europe, for instance, that look at motor units, similar duration, but the results are basically the same,
Yeah.
right? They don't see a change in firing rates. And especially in chronically trained individuals, they don't see a difference in firing rates between those and untrained individuals. And it's likely due to the fact that the trained individuals just have bigger muscles and they just have bigger motor units and they can produce more force. They don't need as much excitation or need to increase the firing rates because those that are recruited are supplementing that force easily.
Yeah. So what do you think's going on then when you have these lifters staying in the same weight class for years, uh, potentially adding muscle, but probably not as much muscle as they're adding to their lifts. What do you think's going on there, training adaptation wise, that's making them stronger, even though they're staying in the same weight class and not putting on a bunch of weight, a bunch of muscle? What do you think that training adaptation is specifically? Is it specifically just they're getting more efficient at the movement pattern and they're just able to um, be more efficient with the way that they're recruiting their motor units, or what do you think's going on there?
Great question. I don't know, and that's like the ultimate question, right? And that's something I plan on doing at some point. But from a, let's say, my personal opinion, it's tough, right? Because they are becoming more efficient. I mean, you see people who are good squatters, they do it so often, they get better at it. But I think after a while, like there's not much more you can improve from a motor perspective, right? So it's interesting. You can go down the rabbit hole of saying maybe they're developing more myofibrillar proteins, right, which allows for more actin and myosin cross bridging to occur, which can increase strength. Um, and one of the big questions I've had for a long time is, well, why is it that there's you have bodybuilders, right, who are jacked, and then you compare them to someone who's a power lifter who isn't as strong. Um, or not strong, but as big. Yet the power lifter is obviously way stronger, right? And it could be the fact that the power lifter just does heavy singles compared to the bodybuilder. But when you're looking at someone that's in the same weight class for so long, what's it contributing or attributing to that increase in strength? I don't know. It could be the training stimulus, right? To your point, maybe they applied a new training stimulus, so they have probably some brain plasticity that occurs. Maybe there's better synaptic impulses, right? Transmission, synaptogenesis, I think is what it's called. But it's really hard because we're so individualized. Like what works for you isn't going to obviously work for another person. And from a research perspective, right? If you find one finding in one person, I remember when I used to look at my data, I'm like, oh, this person's data is going this way. Like, this is so cool. And then you look at the next two people and they like go in the opposite direction. You're like, what? Right. So I don't know, but I do think that potentially, right, it's probably something to do morphologically. Because from a motor perspective, it's not like they're getting better at the squat, right? They could change their stance, they can change their biomechanics. Maybe that improves it a little bit. Um, that could be one way, but for a long period of time, what works best for you. And so, from a neuro perspective, I don't know how much more that can improve.
Yeah. Do you think improving efficiency also improves their ability to recover from training session to training session?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's probably one of the bigger things is your ability to recover plays a huge role, right? Because then you can train more, right? I think recently it's become really important to track sleep, right? We've seen that lack of sleep or sleeping less than a certain amount of hours can actually impact hypertrophy. And we can see it in motor performance. If you're thinking about specific lifts, and then some people are just built different. They wake up after 3 hours of sleep, smoke a cigarette, and just hit a PR, and they're just genetic freaks. But I think for the general population, there are other things that play a bigger role with hitting PRs, and one of them happens to be recovery, um, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I've seen that throughout the years of coaching and training myself is like even when they introduce things like PEDs, they think that that's going to allow them to train more, and so they add more volume, but then they still don't get better because they're still not able to recover from the amount of volume that they did. And I always felt like when you add in certain compounds like that, that improves your ability to recover. That there's no need to add more training stimulus because you're recovering better, right? So when you do become more efficient with the movement patterns by training them over and over again, you can have better recovery rates, I think, because there's not as much damage going on because the firing rates don't necessarily have to be increased, right? And you're not necessarily reaching that maximum threshold every single time because you are becoming more efficient. You did mention something about the idea of actin and myosin either creating new ones or making them more efficient or making them stronger. Has there been research to kind of show that that is something that happens within training, and what kind of training would spark those type of adaptations? Would it be hypertrophy? Would it be strength, plyometrics? Like, what are we talking about there?
Yeah, so I actually don't really know. Once again, the limitation we have is the duration of these studies, right? Let's say you take a muscle biopsy. So there's a couple limitations here. You take a muscle biopsy, and let's say you do an 8-week intervention, and then you take another muscle biopsy. Chances are that that area that you took that sample from isn't the same area, so that composition could be totally different, right? There's that. And so we don't know if the 8 weeks is enough time for someone to develop enough actin and myosin, right? Increasing the quantity of that. That's out of my scope of practice. I don't do that stuff. I do think it'd be cool, and I'm sure someone has done it. I just haven't looked into it. Um, Specifically looking like myosin heavy chain content. Um, but I don't know how long it takes. And so Mike Roberts, coined the term or Mike Roberts and Cody Hahn kind of coined the term sarcoplasmic hypertrophy,
Mhm.
right? Where the volume of that muscle gets bigger, but it could be due to just the sarcoplasm itself increasing, right? And not necessarily the myofibrillar portion of it, which is where we house our actin and myosin. And so one of the ideas is that you build this infrastructure, right? You increase the size, the scaffolding, to allow for those myofibrillar content to increase, right? But I don't know there's a specific type of training. I do think that the biggest thing that really plays a role in all of this is the consistency in training, right? Um, that's why I kind of chuckle when people do like maybe 2 months of training and they just want to get on PEDs because they want to get bigger and stronger
Yeah,
off the bat. And it's just like you haven't even given yourself enough time to like really train, right? Get really good at lifting and seeing what your genetic potential is.
right.
Um,
Yeah. Not only that, but you don't even know it works for you, right? You don't even know what program, what rep schemes, what volume, right? So
mhm.
yeah, I think that delayed gratification makes for the best lifters, and we've seen that. We've seen the best lifters go from natural to enhanced. The ones that were able to stay natural the longest got the most benefits from the enhancement as well, and they were able to see significant improvements once they were able to do that. With the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, um, have there been any studies to replicate that finding? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought Dr. Roberts did a study and found that there was no, like, he did a follow up study and then didn't find any sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So isn't there still some contention on whether or not that actually exists, and the ability to replicate that has been very, very limited?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure there is, and I think that's one of the issues is like. For instance, like my study, right? I found I did something similar to another person's design or another study design, and our findings are somewhat similar but different, right? And I think that there's always going to be equivocal findings no matter how you go about it.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure. I mean, it's still kind of up in the air, and I think they wrote a review. It's the unicorn of hypertrophy. Is like we don't know if it actually exists or not.
Yeah.
We speculate, and it's all a theory. It's a speculation. But it kind of like it's a cool theory if you want to think about it, because like in my case, right, we had these individuals that had 20%. I think the difference in hypertrophy was the hypertrophy group had a 20% increase in VL cross sectional area, so the vastus lateralis or the lateral quad muscle, and then the strength group had like a 4% increase.
Mhm.
So that's a huge margin of hypertrophy difference, right? And so if one group got way bigger, 5 times bigger almost, why isn't that 5 times increase in muscle size playing an increase or difference in the training or the 1RM, right? Or increase in strength?
Yeah.
So, okay, cool. What would have been cool was to do obviously, continuing the study and doing it for another 8 weeks, right? Maybe after week 10, that additional hypertrophy now starts to become a little more um, involved, right? And increasing strength. And that's when probably we'll see the disparity in the strength increase. But then I also think, what if it's just the training itself, right?
Mhm.
What if you just practice training with heavy loads? You're going to get better at training heavy loads,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know how much of a role muscle or change in muscle size plays a role in all this. But we know that typically people with bigger muscles are stronger than others, right?
Yeah.
But whether hyperplasmic hypertrophy is real or myofiliar hypertrophy is real, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
I think that's where we're going to be stuck at for a long time with this debate is this it's a lot of correlational stuff.
mhm.
It's very hard to create causation and create these variances of what's contributing to what because we just don't have the technology nor the time to actually do those in-depth studies. Which makes for good rhetoric online,
Oh yeah.
of a back and forth debate that can't be proven by either cohort of arguments. But I think those are the best debates to get into because you're never going to be right or wrong. So it makes for good ego building on your own.
Oh, for sure. Especially when like, does it really matter?
Right? Does it?
Because
Yeah.
like, okay, so for instance, I had a 66 kilo lifter, right? Small guy, really strong, great deadlifter, right? Has the best proportions for deadlifter, but horrible bencher, right? No hate towards him, but he just wasn't a good bencher. And no matter how many times we've tried different ways, we increase volume, we increase frequency, we just could not get that bench to move, right? And that can be my limitation as a coach, right? Maybe I don't have enough experience to find the perfect technique or the perfect way to improve his bench, right? But then I have other people who just are good benchers and just have huge pecs. So I always had the question, what if certain movements are more dependent on muscle size than others,
Yeah.
right? Because if you think about the bench, some of the best benchers just have huge chests and
Yeah.
triceps,
Big rib
right?
cages, right?
Yeah,
Big barrel chest. Yeah.
perfect. And then some of the best squatters, they may not have huge legs, but they may have like strong hamstrings or glutes,
Yeah.
right? So
Or
there's
even
this
good like bone morphology that allows them to have really great leverages to have a really good squat.
right? So it's so tough, but it's a fun like questions. Like, does it play that big of a role? If it does, then should we just focus on getting as big as possible? I don't know.
Yeah.
Most of the training I like to do is kind of I think they term it power building,
Oh yeah, yeah. That's I
right?
mean, what we like to do in strength sports is like take these concepts that have stood the test of time of like, let's get stronger and bigger, and then coin it, like hybrid athletes. It's like, you mean you run and lift weights like every other athlete that plays sports? Like, but
Yeah,
yeah, we can categorize it however you want to. Yeah, get big and strong. Power
yeah,
building. Fantastic. We'll put a label on it.
for sure. And it works, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, for me as a coach and as a lifter, it's like you want the program that is the most enjoyable, and you want the program that is specific to your sport, and you want the exercises that don't get you injured. If you can do
Oh,
those three
huge.
things, you're going to be the best that you can be for your genetic potential. All the other stuff is just kind of arbitrary at that point, you know?
Oh, I agree, 100%. Especially with the finding things that you not only enjoy but you can recover from. Right.
Yeah.
My favorite is I had this athlete. He's a genetic freak. Like I just don't get it, you know. But he cracks me up because we're prepping him for a powerlifting meet, and he's a already strong kid. And he's like, I hit 315 on bench today. I was like, why? He's like, oh, I just want to see how strong I am right now. He can bench 315 easy now, right? But
Yeah.
like during prep, I was like, why are you getting close to your max? Like, you know, like it's just follow the program. But I wanted to see. And then like before the meet, he says, my shoulder hurts. Okay, cool. Let's just back off of on the bench press. Yeah, I hit 275 for 8. What are you doing? Like, you know, like it just you can be the best coach, come up with the coolest program, and then occasionally you're going to find an athlete that just wants to deviate from the program.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. There's some athletes that I have to preface with like, if there's any pain in any of the movements, quit doing it, because they'll email me and be like, "Yeah, I did this movement, all three sets. I had extreme pain in my adductor muscles." I'm like, and you just kept going, like, "Yeah, I just thought I'd tell you afterwards." Instead, I'm like, you got to be kidding me." But you know, sometimes the denser the athlete, the stronger they get. It's you know, it's good for them.
Yeah.
One of the studies we did together, we looked at BFR and the role that blood flow restriction has on motor units. What one what makes the technique of BFR effective in its application, and what did we see in terms of alterations of motor unit behavior when applying BFR to the training study that we did?
Yeah. So one of the biggest benefits with blood flow restriction is that you can essentially get the same benefit of training with a higher load without necessarily training with the higher loads. And what I mean by that is by occluding the artery, right? You're essentially building more metabolic byproduct, which could cause hypertrophy to occur, which would then lead individuals to think that, well, okay, I apply this tourniquet, right? I increase or induce blood flow restriction. And the adaptation is that I don't have to train with heavy loads, but I do have to train at lighter loads with more reps, more volume, essentially, right? Um, and then you get the benefit of not only getting bigger, but potentially getting stronger compared to training only with lighter loads, right? So if you're a bodybuilder and you don't want to train all day, right? Because when you train with light loads, typically you're going to do a bunch of reps. Okay. So if you apply a blood flow restriction, you can still train with the lighter loads, but your time in the gym is probably cut in half, or if not,
Yeah.
you know, 2/3. And not only that, but you experience more hypertrophy and you get stronger. So cool, awesome. Typically, BFR was used in like clinical settings, like rehab, right, where individuals are immobilized and they can't really go through a range of motion, let alone like apply resistance or high resistance against themselves. But in our study, you had a publication and I had a publication look at the motor unit stuff. I'll talk about mine, but I'm more excited to hear about yours. In my study, we did a single contraction. We wanted to see how soon does blood flow restriction actually influence the way motor units behave. And so our population were trained individuals, so that was kind of novel in a sense. And we found that as soon as you apply that tourniquet and we start to produce force, the immediate increase in firing rates was pretty observant, right? So, and once again, typically what we see is the lower threshold motor units, the ones that are recruited first and activated first, have a higher firing rate compared to a later recruited higher threshold motor unit. But we found that with the blood flow restriction, during a single contraction at about 40% of their maximal effort, we saw an significant increase in the firing rates of the lower threshold motor units, right? And that was maintained during a steady contraction. So even though it's only 40%, the blood flow restriction induced an increase in that excitation of the lower threshold motor units, um, without necessarily recruiting additional motor units. So that was interesting. We have another paper in the works now where when they're doing a 70% contraction, so a little harder, still just one, and it's not fatigue inducing, or at least not to failure. They not only saw an increase in the firing rates for the lower threshold motor units, but also recruited additional motor units, larger motor units. So something about the effort needed while you're doing blood flow restriction is probably the reason why we see that increase in hypertrophy, right? With the blood flow restriction, you have afferent signals that are going to the spinal cord and saying, hey, we have this sensory information that's telling us one, we have metabolic byproduct being accumulated. We have chemoreceptors and mechanical receptors being activated. So they're going to excite the motor neuron pool. And then you have information from the brain going down saying, hey, your effort seems to be harder, right, or greater because you're wearing this cuff. And it's somewhat discomforting, but you want to complete that task. You're trying a little harder. And so by doing so, you're not only increasing the fire rates of the already active motor units, but you're having to recruit additional motor units that are typically larger in size. And so I say we, but I think the general consensus is in order for you to maximize hypertrophy, you have to essentially provide those fibers with some type of stimulus. They have to be recruited, right? They have to be recruited in order to be stimulated and go through the whole process of hypertrophying. And so the benefit of doing blood flow restriction, in my opinion, is that you're able to tap into those motor units doing a lighter intensity contraction. And that's just with a single contraction. Now, in your study, we did reps to failure, right? And I'll let you kind of talk about it if you like, or I can take the show. It's up to you.
Yeah, yeah. I can kind of lay the groundwork with the what the study was, but you're the expert in this area. I was just happy to tag along and help out the best I could. But yeah, we did 50% of their MVC. So we did the same thing, isometric bicep contraction, and they traced the trapezoid. And the reason we trace the trapezoid is because that's how we're able to collect the motor unit decomposition data, right? So it's not necessarily that we thought isometric contractions and tracing was the best intervention, but that's the only way that we can actually get a hold of each individual motor unit as it gets recruited. And that's why the whole ramp up process is slow and 5 seconds continuous. So we did that. And then they held the isometric contraction for 7 to 10 seconds, and then down ramp back down 5 seconds. And they did that for as many reps as they could with and without BFR. And the overall kind of key finding that we found was that motor unit recruitment was very similar, but the BFR group did a total of 3 less reps, so they were able to get the same kind of train in neuromuscular adaptations with less total volume than the group that did no BFR. Um, Within that study, though, we did find some genetic outliers that were very interesting. We had a couple people do more reps with BFR than without BFR, which could be indicative of a lot of things, but definitely their ability to sustain and the variety of repetitions that we saw, anywhere from 2 reps at 50% with BFR to like 30, I think, or 32 was the extreme, shows the interindividuality of each individual person, and maybe seeing where those differences lie could be create a better understanding of what training that person could specifically be doing to develop those weaknesses, and maybe that could be that novel stimulus that they're looking for based off of muscle fiber type, oxygen delivery, and stuff like that. But go ahead and add in anything else you want to within the realm of that study and those findings.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much, hit around the head. But I think what you said was most important was the fact that the way we look at motor units is during an isometric contraction. And I meant to say this way long ago. One of the issues that we have with training studies, kind of backtracking a little bit, is that the way we assess motor unit behavior is during an isometric contraction. Now, you might think to yourself, well, when do I ever do anything isometric, right? And so it's very hard to look at motor unit behavior during dynamic contractions for a multitude of reasons, right? But getting back on the task at hand. So, yeah, what you guys found was basically the rate of recruitment of motor units was very similar between the BFR and control. However, the BFR treatment caused that earlier recruitment to occur, right? They did less reps but had the same response. So it kind of goes back to the whole concept that the benefit of doing BFR is that you have some necessity to recruit these motor units, right? That you would have probably recruited later down the road, but you recruited them earlier, all right, because of X, Y, and Z, right? Afferent signaling, the central nervous system playing a role in all this. And so the big difference between our two studies is that in my, we found that the firing rates changed between the two conditions within a single contraction. Within your study, the only thing that really differed was the rate of recruitment, right? The actual potential size of the motor unit sizes, or the way we recruit motor units was different between the conditions, but the firing rates weren't, right? And that might be due to a couple different things. Like you said, you have some outliers who did more reps than the others. Once again, it's when we produce force, it's kind of this combination of both like firing rates, right? Adjusting the firing rates of active motor units and then recruiting additional motor units when necessary. And so in that study, most likely the best and optimal route of maintaining force while you're doing those tracing is probably recruiting additional motor units, right? Rather than relying on increasing the firing rates during a fatiguing task, which is super interesting in my opinion, right? And that kind of goes back to the whole idea that if you want to increase the size of certain motor units, right? And I love when people talk about you got to recruit the motor units, you got to train to failure, this recruits motor unit, blah, blah, blah. Is like, I don't think people really understand how motor units are recruited,
Yeah,
right?
I think that's a
Like you
staple
need enough,
function.
yeah, you need enough stimulus, right? To reach a certain threshold for that motor unit to be recruited. And so when people say when you train to failure at light load, you're recruiting the whole motor unit pool, that's not necessarily true. You're recruiting whatever your brain thinks it needs to complete that task, right? And then eventually what happens when you fail is that you fail to for a multitude of reasons, right? There's probably too much metabolic product, hydrogen ions running around. They're impeding your ability to contract the muscle. There's sensory information that's probably decreasing the neural drive. So, in order for you to tap into those higher threshold motor units, you have to give it a proper stimulus, right? And there's a couple papers now that show that even if you did, let's say, um, reps to failure at 30%, you would never really ever recruit the same motor units if you did a 70% contraction or an 80% contraction. So if you want to activate the motor units that you need to do um, higher intensity exercise, my intensity, I mean like load, right? You have to essentially target those. The only way to do that is to be training closer to that load. So I love when people are like, yeah, if you train to failure, you're recruiting the whole motor unit pool. It's like, you're not. You're recruiting what you need. And when you stop, that's the ones that were recruited are the ones that were stimulated enough to have some type of adaptation.
Yeah, which is why it's important to train at a variety of rep ranges and get as strong as possible in each one of those rep ranges in order for you to get the adaptations and that you're trying to reach for.
Exactly.
Now, one of the limitations we have as researchers is we're limited by the technology that we use and the technology that we have capabilities of using for the questions that we're trying to answer. You use mechanomyography, you use EMG for decomposition. You've also used transcranial magnetic stimulation. Kind of go over what each one of those are, what they do, what they provide for the study that you're what you were looking at the time, and what are some of the limitations that they have?
Yeah, so mechanomyography, it's the we like to say it's the mechanical counterpart to EMG. So electromyography or EMG is the excitatory response, right? The muscle excitation that we record. So when we have a sensor over the legs, as the muscle fibers are being activated, they're being activated because of an action potential that kind of runs across the fiber, right? And so when they're activated, we have these action potentials that are being read by the surface EMG, and it gives you this giant big burst of just squiggly lines, right? Which we then can decompose and differentiate between the motor unit based off the exponential waveform, and then how often they're firing based off of how many times we see those waveforms, right, in the time domain. Now, mechanical myography is the recording of sound waves, technically. And so, what it's doing, it's essentially picking up the vibrations of those fibers. And it responds very similar, right? They basically kind of tell us the same thing. And it's kind of appropriate to measure both EMG and MMG together because they paint a bigger picture. And so the amplitude of the MMG signal really tells us the essentially unfused motor units that are being activated, right? So as you start to increase force, right, you're recruiting more and more motor units. So that signal is oscillating rapidly and in great amplitude. But as you're maintaining let's say you do a 40% contraction, you get up to that 40% plateau. As you're maintaining that, eventually you'll start to see that that signal starts to diminish and it gets smaller and thinner, right? And the idea is that those motor units are essentially starting to fuse or tetanize. So it's not oscillating as often as frequently. Sorry, it's oscillating more frequently to the point where it's starting to become steady, right? It's tetanizing. And so that signal might shrink, and we can consider that as like the muscle stiffening. Um, the limitation behind that is we don't know exactly what's happening with the motor units, right? We don't know if the motor units did in fact increase their firing rates, or um, if we recruited additional motor units and so forth. So it's a lot of speculation, but it's a nice speculation because when you pair that with the EMG signal, right? And the EMG signal, once again, is that burst that is corresponding with the motor units that are being activated and then their firing rates. And so if something happens in the EMG that's changing, we can actually interpret the MMG and say, okay, I think this is what's happening, right? We see an increase in the burst in the EMG signal, but no change in the MMG signal. Then we can assume that potentially what's happening is there's an increasing firing rates, and those firing rates are essentially starting to tetanize, right? And so the signal is getting smaller. But if we see an increase in the EMG signal and then a continuous increase in the MMG signal, then potentially what's happening is we're recruiting additional motor units, right? Those larger motor units are essentially oscillating, right, frequently. So they're not tetanizing. And so that's going to give us a larger burst. The fibers themselves are twitching, right? Um, so you essentially pair those up. Once again, the limitation here is that you really can't determine what's happening, whether it's you're recruiting more additional motor units, or they're increasing their firing rates, or they're tetanizing completely. So you use methods that you can decompose from the EMG signal to kind of infer what exactly is happening. Now, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS for short, is a method where you essentially use this device that changes the electromagnetic field, right? That's going to excite the nerves in the brains to essentially activate. And so when you stimulate over the motor cortex region of interest, say your leg muscle, right, there's a specific area in your brain that you can stimulate and is going to cause your muscle to contract or activate. Um, the big thing here is that when you're doing that, you're exciting both excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons. And so the net outcome, right, is going to cause a cortical excitability contraction, or sorry, a motor evoked potential, or MAP for short. And what we do is we apply a EMG signal over the muscle. We can actually see when that signal from the brain reaches the motor unit pool in the spinal cord and activates, the motor units that reach that threshold that's being provided from that stimulation, we get a all at once action potential, right? All those motor units are activated at once, and we get one giant waveform, and we can see that giant waveform, and that's the motor evoked potential, right? With my study, I was interested to see if different types of training actually causes that MET to change in size, right? So not only can we see the change in the MEP in size, but we can actually see what's known as the latency, right? How long does it take for that signal from the brain to reach that sensor, right? So we did that over the motor cortex, and we found that the signal did in fact increase in size. But what was interesting was the change for the hypertrophy group was greater than the change for the strength group. Both increase in size, and we compare that to the control group. Um, we saw an increase in the size, and it was greater for the hypertrophy group compared to the control group as well, but the strength group. So it kind of begs the question. Sometimes when we look at the EMG signal, the amplitude of that signal is probably really dependent on the size of the fibers, right? The bigger the fiber, the greater the axe potential that's going to be elicited. So, one potential mechanism or rationale behind the differences between the hypertrophy and the strength group is that the hypertrophy group, because they have a bigger muscle, that larger muscle causes a larger axe potential to occur, right? So you're going to see a bigger map. Um, so we don't know if the change in the map for the hypertrophy group is due to the fact that it's a neural adaptation or if a morphological adaptation, right? In the strength group, it did increase, but not as much as the hypertrophy group. So we assume that potentially what's happening is that there is more of a neural adaptation, right? It's more of a neural uh, uh, involvement. We have other variables of interest, right? So we have the short interval intercortical inhibition, which is a really fancy way of looking at inhibition within the motor cortex, right? And so it's assumed, and there's a couple of studies that support this, that as we become trained, we have less inhibition, right? That means that there's more excitatory responses occurring in the brain when you stimulate compared to inhibitory responses. And we found that in both training groups, no difference between the training groups, which is super cool. And then we looked at the latency, right? How long does it take for that signal to travel from the brain to the sensor? Both groups had a similar change. All right, so it seems like the training itself was very, or the training itself caused a very similar neural adaptation, except for the MEP amplitude, which is probably derived from the size of the muscle, right? The hypertrophy that occurred for the hypertrophy group, which is super interesting. Um, we stimulated over the brain, we stimulated over the spinal cord and over the leg. And what was kind of interesting is at the spinal cord, that's where we saw some differences between groups or more differences. Um, the MEP, I call it the SMEP amplitude, right? So spinal motor evoked potential was actually greater for the um, hypertrophy group without a change in the strength group. And one potential reasoning is that maybe because the hypertrophy group is doing those like high repetition training at low loads, that they start to develop more, uh, what do they call it? Spinal circuitry, right? The neural connections in the spinal cord are essentially increasing. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why there's more excitatory response that's occurring at the spinal cord when we stimulate over the spinal cord and bypassing the brain. So that's interesting, and no one's ever done that. No one's ever actually seen if the SMEP itself can change in size. And it was also the only hypertrophy group was the only one that saw a significant change in the latency when you stimulate over the spinal cord compared to the strength group. All
Yeah,
right.
that is very interesting. Especially the differences, the divergence of the brain to the spinal cord, and why that would be the case. I do know that the research kind of lends itself to thinking that the higher volume training is more central nervous system fatiguing, right? So, could there be some theory or some concept behind training at those higher volumes to failure could be creating better neural adaptations centrally as opposed to peripherally, and therefore you're going to get more excitability within that domain because single reps aren't really taxing the central system as much? Or is that something that is a little too far fetched to?
No, I mean it makes sense, right? Uh, Central fatigue is such a weird word for me because, like, your central nervous system doesn't necessarily fatigue, right? It modulates, right? There's going to be more inhibition to control and protect the body. But yet, to your point, yeah, I think that the fact that we're essentially doing more reps, right, high volume rep stuff, that there potentially is a neural adaptation that is accumulating at the central nervous system, right, especially at the spinal cord. Um, it's tough because once again, when we stimulate over the brain or stimulate over the spinal cord, it's a battle between inhibitory and excitatory neurons. So we don't know, is there more excitatory or is there less inhibition? It's kind of hard to determine, but it's the cool thing about this is like it seems to be affected by training, right? Modality. And so there's a lot of different ways you can approach this. Well, what if you have a group that doesn't do the high low training but only does the hypertrophy stuff? Would they have a similar response? Because you got to keep in mind, both training groups did the high low training, right? Both groups increase in strength similarly. There's a study by Jenkins et al. Where they compare low load to high low training to failure. Both groups had a similar increase in hypertrophy, but only the high low group actually saw an increase in the 1RMs and MVCs, so maximum voluntary contractions, um, and then a greater increase in just raw EMG, right? So it's kind of hard to determine. Well, if the group did hypertrophy and they're doing all this, extra work, is the additional um, neural adaptations due to the training itself, or is it due to the morphological change? So that's definitely a follow up study at some point. I just
Yeah.
don't know if I have the bandwidth to do another giant training study like that again.
Yeah, no, I don't blame you. And also too, there's something to be said about the idea of improving MVC not necessarily being um having the same carryover as improving your one rep max on an actual lift, right? There's a lot of limitations to doing MVCs as opposed to what you did. You did MVCs, but you also did one rep maxes as well. So we're able to get both of those things. And I think that's what one of the things I always harp on with research is you can typically tell when the researchers doing training interventions have never really trained themselves
Oh yeah,
because they just miss so many things that people that actually train and train athletes realize are dramatically important. So when you did yours and when I heard you doing yours, I was like, man, this is gonna be really cool because it's actually like real world application. It's not just mechanisms because mechanisms without function, um, to me, we've had this talk a lot, is like it's just very boring. It's just there's I need to know the function of it. I need to know what the application is, right? Because we've seen many studies where the mechanism is X, Y, and Z, but then when you carry it over to practical application, it has no relevance at all, right? And you're just like, well, what was the point of the study? It was like because you wanted to do something cool for your research friends, or are you actually trying to do research that's like going to carry over to practitioners and the training population? And that kind of brings up the next thing that I want to talk about is like we you have all these findings and all this research you're doing. How do they support um, how does neuromuscular research lend itself to practical applications in the real world that practitioners, therapists can listen to what you're saying and say, hey, this is what Alex is saying. How can I apply this to get benefits in the real world? What are some of the key takeaways that we can think of when trying to apply this area of research with motor units and TMS and all this cool stuff that you're doing that actual people can take and run with?
yeah. It's tough, right? Because the general population doesn't need to worry about neural adaptations because when you start to when you start to train, you have what's known as, or after a single bout, you have what's known as like the repeat bout effect, right? You do something, it's hard, you're sore, but the next time you do it, becomes easier, right? Um, but most people don't have to worry. Are my motor units firing at optimal level, right? Or is uh, is the latency between the way my brain is sending signals to my muscle increasing? Probably not. The only people that would probably be concerned about this stuff are clinical patients, right? People that have lesions in the brains or are undergoing rehab, where you're trying to find ways to assess, right, the recovery rate without having them go through a dynamic protocol, right? Which is why I think doing isometric contractions is really nice, because you can see, in real time, um, potential changes from a neural perspective, right? And what I mean by that is you can do stimulation over a nerve, right? And depending on how that waveform, or the size of the waveform, the latency is looking pre and post op, can determine whether they're healthy enough to return or go to the next stage.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But like for an avid person who's constantly going to the gym, they don't the neuromuscular stuff, in my personal opinion, right? People will probably argue against me and say, no, that's not fair. Um, it probably doesn't matter. It just helps explain why we're seeing these changes. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. So do you think with the idea that maybe in a rehab setting, say we're dealing with athletes, right? Athletes that tore their ACL. Um, if we could do a pre post test to see MEPS and latency, could that over time tell us that they're ready to return to play, less likely to get injured? Like, is any of that stuff applicable to that? Or could it potentially be applicable if the research was done? Could that be something that could be used to understand latency and MEPS in terms of like actual real world application, or even with elderly population where risk of fall, right? Maybe latency could be something that could be something that we could use as a test to determine if this person is at greater risk of falls, right? Is that something that we could use for that?
Yeah, and I mean that's a good point, right? It's you're looking at a population where there's potentially harm, right, that can come their way if they do something, and you're trying to provide a test that is feasible, right? The hard part is when you're doing a TMS, right? Stimulation is that you have to have them in a chair, you have to set up this gear. It's a little process. Um, but in some way, actually, I thought about doing this here as a potential project. I'm working with the rugby team, the women's rugby team here, as a strength coach, and I wanted to do athlete monitoring, right? And one of the tests I wanted to do is TMS, right? Does cortical excitability, or the inhibition that occurs in the motor cortex, does that change throughout the season? If so, what part of the season are we seeing the greatest decrease, right? And maybe that's when we start to focus a little more on recovery, or maybe switching the training to be a little more explosive in emphasis, right? Because we know that for at least for older adults, um, their ability to produce force rapidly or power rapidly is probably the biggest predictor for all cause mortality, right? Fall risk. So um, these tests are great, but probably doing more practical tests is better, right? So in rehab settings, you can use a isokinetic dynamometer, right, and measure torque, because ultimately torque makes more sense than a electrical signal, right? But the electrical signal is nice because it allows us to infer what is happening. So, for instance, with ACL rehab, they found that the motor units actually change in, I think it's ACL, the firing rates of the VL differ from the VM, right? Post op. So, what does that really mean? I don't know. Probably that there's more compensation in the VM than in the VL, right? And so maybe if that's the case, then we'll try to focus on improving the VL. But when you train the legs, you're training the whole quad.
Right.
So does it really matter?
Right. Yeah, but you could train specifically to target the VL as much as possible, whether it be
Hmm.
through like rotation of the legs, exercise selection, things like that. I mean, that would explain why things like terminal knee extensions and getting the quad, especially the VL, as strong as possible, or the yeah, and that having better carryover to their rehab process. I think finding ways to create those markers of potential return to play can do a couple things, right? It can let the practitioner know like, hey, we're making the improvements we need to make, but it can also build the confidence in the athlete because now they have some technology to also indicate like, hey, we're getting better, we're making the improvements that we need to make on the areas that were subsequently like injured or turned off, or whatever you want to say. And that
Hmm.
would be with the female rugby. When you were talking about that, one of the things that would be really cool is if you did, I don't know how often you're going to do the TMS if you do it, but comparing that to also injuries throughout the season as well, and
Hmm.
seeing if that, hey, if inhibition is lower, did that correlate to more injuries for each individual person? And then you could manipulate training volume, load, things like that throughout the season. So I think there could be potential uses for that. But when it comes to actually getting stronger and putting on more muscle, you're right. There's probably nothing that we would do differently in terms of training based off of the research. It does just kind of tell us what's happening inside the muscle, and um, whether or not those differences really matter. And it sounds like there's potential that hypertrophy training could be beneficial in terms of increasing certain motor unit capabilities, but we don't have the research to know longevity wise whether or not that actually matters or not. We would assume it does because why wouldn't it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But I don't necessarily know if that would change the way that you train. I think what we touched on earlier with it, like recovery, specificity, and not getting injured and enjoying the process. If you can do those four things, like that's all that really matters. Unless you have some, what do you think about that?
I agree. And I talk about my study a lot, but we actually just submitted a paper looking at the same groups, but we did a test where they did those tracings to failure, pre and post. But at post, we did it at the same target as we did pre, right? And so, in theory, because both groups got stronger, they should have been able to do more reps, right? It's an easier load. It shouldn't be as hard. And what was interesting was that it may not necessarily be interesting, and it makes sense, is that the hypertrophy group, because they were training at low loads but like high repetitions, they essentially built some fatigue resistance, right? And they actually completed more reps, at least a minute's worth more reps than the strength group that actually did the same amount of reps, right? And then you start looking at the EMG side of things, and we found that it was similar between the groups as far as the activation deactivation process, right? So going up on the trapezoid shape and down on the trapezoid shape, we found that they actually had a decrease in the EMG activity, right? And then during the steady portion, the hypertrophy group, right, that did more reps, actually had a lower EMG compared to a relatively lower EMG compared to pre. Um, and so, in a way, not only have they become stronger, got bigger, but from a neuro cost perspective, they became more efficient. So it's neat, right? Because when we use an absolute load versus a relative load, and people might be asking, like, why didn't you do a relative load? Well, sometimes when you do a relative load, the performance it's going to be the same, right? If your 1 RM is 100% or 100 pounds, and you do 80% to failure, you do 8 reps or 5 reps, whatever the number of reps you complete, and then you increase your 1 RM to 200 pounds. If you added or had 80% on the bar, chances are you're going to do the same amount of reps, right? Because it's at a relative load. But at an absolute load, you would expect that the strength group, because they got stronger, they should have done more reps. But because they didn't practice, the fatigue aspect of lifting, they did the same amount of reps, if not less. And they actually had the same amount of excitation necessary to complete the same task, even though, once again, it's easier, or should in theory be easier. So to your point, yeah, right. Training specificity plays a huge role. Recovery is huge. Um, I mean, there's so many things that can play a role. You can start going down the nutrition rabbit hole, but
Yeah,
I'm not an expert in that,
yeah,
so
yeah,
I'm not going to speak on that.
yeah. I mean, I always say like the biggest knobs you can turn is sleep, nutrition, proper programming, right? If you can get those three things down and consistency, like you're golden. But the stuff that you're doing is cool because, and especially where you're going, obviously you're limited by your role that you have to play as a PhD student. But now that you are a professor, you can take your research exactly the route that you want to go, which I'm excited to see and to talk about, which brings me to the next thing to kind of go over is, um, what was your general experience like, from a master's to a PhD to a professor? Like what are the trials and tribulations that you learn from the most, and what could be some general guidelines that you can give to people to, be as productive as possible without going down the rabbit hole of burning out, which some is something that you suffered with your last year as well.
Mhm. Yeah. So during my master's, it was a really fun experience because I actually started doing research my junior year of undergrad. I worked with Dr. Garrett Hester at Kennesaw State University. Awesome man. Like to this day, I still reach out to him because he is the definition of a mentor, right? He walked every step with me. And then for my thesis, it was a we looked at middle age and older adults, and we were assessing predictors of walking velocity, right? So we see that as you get older, your gait speed decreases, right? So we're trying to see what are the predictors for that. And then, are there differences in neuromuscular parameters? Really, are there differences in strength and power between middle age and older adults that are only separated by 10 years? So, our middle age group was 40 to 49, and our older adults were 60 to 69. So I guess 20 years
Yeah.
difference. Um, and that process was hard because I had to not only recruit older adults that are inactive, right, sedentary adults, but middle-aged adults who are working full
Right.
time, right? And I
Responsibilities, a
basically
life,
had,
all that stuff. Yeah.
yeah, it was 3 visits, and it was tough. But the nice part was when you have a good mentor, he is going to help you, and he helped me. I was recruiting. I don't know how many people I talked to but for every 100 people I talked to, I got one participant.
Yeah. Sounds
Right.
about right. Yeah.
Right. But my experience was I was in a really good lab, surrounded by really good colleagues, and I learned a lot. That was the biggest thing. Was I was involved in every project I could possibly involve with, even if they didn't want me there. I was like, I'm gonna learn. I want to be there. Um, and so I think that catapulted me. Well, after my master's, I took a year off. I kind of want to decompress a little bit. I taught at a college adjunct, and then COVID hit. And then I was getting bored. So with the stimulus checks we got from the government, I bought a bunch of textbooks and I just started reading them. And I was like, oh man, it'd be so cool. We did a study like this and that, blah, blah, blah. And then Dr. Hester reached out and was like, hey, they actually have a PhD position available if you want to take it. And I was like, oh, snap, I have to. Right. So I reached out to his previous advisor, which was Dr. Jason DeFreitas at Oklahoma State University, who's now at Syracuse. Um, I talked to him. He said, hey, we do have positions available. I just don't have any PhD slots for you. But there's one with Dr. Michael Trevino, who was my PhD advisor at Oklahoma State. And he does motor unit stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I have some experience with motor units. And so when I went to Oklahoma State, um, they had all the same equipment that I had at Kennesaw State. So I was like, oh, it's like I never left. And so it was really nice because when I was there, I was teaching all the other PhD students that didn't have much research exposure to different equipment, how to use everything. So I was, involved in all these studies. We collaborated on project. We did, I don't know how many projects I did during my PhD. And I was really excited to write. And uh, Dr. Trevino is really good at writing,
Yeah.
like so good. And that was my weakness is writing. I love data collection. I love talking to participants. As you know, right? I get
Yeah.
carried off with the conversation with participants. But writing was so hard for me. And working with him, I've developed that skill set. And I think that was one of the best things I could have done is work with Trevino was practicing writing. And we published a lot together. And I'm really grateful for that. Um, but Yeah, the best thing you can do is reach out to faculty. If you're an undergrad, try to find somewhere where you can get in a lab, even if it's just pushing buttons, right? Asking questions, really understanding the material, and getting involved in projects, going to conferences. I have 4 students now that have never had any experience in research. That we just submitted 4 abstracts and they got approved. And I'm taken to the first conference in February. And as a mentor, I'm super excited because I was like, I want you to have the same excitement that I had as an undergrad, right? Um, and once you get to the master's level, when you're looking for a master's program, I highly recommend reaching out to faculty, right? Seeing, like, looking up to see what you like to do, finding people that do the same research, right? And then not only reach out to the faculty, but see if you can find a way to reach out to their students, right? And seeing what their students' experience is. Because I have some friends in the PhD that had, they found an advisor that's, well renowned, liked, and everything. And then they got nothing out of it, which super sucks because you're like, man, I just not necessarily wasted 4 years, but it's a commitment to
Hmm.
do a graduate program, right? You need to benefit from it. So definitely talk to, a professor, whoever you want to do research with. Talk to the students. Check out the lab, see what they have, and ask about projects they're going to work on. Um, don't be afraid to ask questions. I think that was one of the biggest things I really enjoyed was when I talked to Dr. DeFreitas. I'm a kid at heart, right? And so I would just like come up with all these ideas, and I was like, what is this? What is that? And some of the best conversations I had with faculty was just me being silly and asking what I thought was a dumb question, and they're like, "No, that's actually a good question." And then we went down this rabbit hole, and I walked out of there like, "Oh my god, I learned so much." And to finish it off, when you're doing your PhD, uh, try to see if you can help out with other labs, learn different techniques, different skill sets. You'd be surprised what you thought you were interested in, and that changes. Originally, I was going to do body composition stuff, right? Comparing overweight versus normal weight individuals. But like the meathead, I don't want to say meathead, but the lifter that I am, I'm not very strong, but I want to know what makes us strong. I was lucky enough that Trevino was like, yeah, do your dissertation, design your dissertation. Just make sure it includes motor units, right? And I was super lucky that I got to essentially run the study of my dreams and, do that. And I highly recommend making as many friends as you can because you never know when you're going to need an extra pair of hands to press a button for you. And don't walk into the room just because you've done research in the past or published in the past that you're, the top gun, right? Because just like anywhere else, once you build a reputation for yourself, whether it's good or bad, it's going to follow, and it can definitely impact your experience in the PhD. Um, and then I guess the last thing is have a good work life balance. Like Tony was saying, towards the end of my PhD, it was brutal. I was working really hard, and it was worth it, yes, but at what cost? It's not like I couldn't have done it. It couldn't have been easier, but knowing when to say no or knowing how to manage your time better plays a huge role. And I'm a overachiever. I want to be the best at everything I do, but the problem is at what cost? And that was brutal. But I'm grateful for where I am now. I'm at an awesome university. I have great students, not kids, students, and I get to do the research I want to do. And then, like, there's no better feeling to be like, you know what? I'm in charge now.
Yeah.
And now that I'm in charge, I'm like, okay, I guess I'm in charge and I can't mess this up. So you're paying more attention to like the finer details and things, and um, it's fun. If you ever get a chance to mentor a student, it's definitely worth it because you get to see them grow. And when they have that aha moment and start coming up with ideas themselves, you're like, yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of the idea that work life balance, right? Like, I remember first coming in, one, you definitely taught me the most out of anybody that I've worked with so far, professors and students. So I'm very grateful for that. But yeah, when I first met you, there was this huge level of excitement for what you were doing. and what the future held. And then as the time went on, I start to see the life getting sucked out of you. And not to over dramatize it, but it definitely seemed like you were going down a path where like you didn't want to do research anymore. It was kind of a darker time for you where you definitely pulled back and you definitely hid more and you were more isolated and you weren't necessarily as cheerful as you normally were, right? And you were really contemplating like what did you want to do with the rest of your life? Like was this all for nothing? Do I hate it now? What do I do next? What were some of the challenges that you went through mentally that you worked your way through, and how did you work your way through those things to get to where you are now, reinvigorated, excited to do research, excited to mentor, and all that stuff?
Yeah. So the hardest part was, like you said, I wasn't myself, right? I knew the work had to get done. And that was like all I can think about was like, I got to get this done. I got to get this done. I got to get this done because the next step is finding a job, right? And so you have the academic version of a resume is the curriculum vitae, right? Just the CV, right? And when you're applying to these academic positions, you want to show that you know your stuff and you're a capable candidate. And so in my head, I was like, I gotta pump out more papers. I gotta show that I'm this. I gotta show that I'm that. I was applying to all these places, and my dad, he's it's something that's always stuck to me, and my mom as well. They always said, my dad would say, never sell yourself short, and my mom would always say, just para adelante, just keep going forward, right? And so some of the things that I came across towards that last fall really was when I was at my lowest was I wasn't happy. I wasn't exercising. I was heading towards the end of a relationship that I've cultivated for the past 5 years at the time. My interests and hobbies were no longer there. Um, like I was still hanging out with friends and doing things, but I was just more irritable, because like all I can think about was getting this dissertation done, getting it done, finding a job. And then like your last year of your PhD, you're completing your dissertation, you're finishing whatever publication you're working on, you're doing other projects, right? Because you have a lab and your lab is doing other projects besides your own. Um, you are trying to have somewhat of a social life if you can. And for me, the hardest part was having to say goodbye to, someone that I've lived with for so many years. And, drifted apart. And I was stuck between trying to fix that relationship or finish my PhD. And I was grateful enough that they never did anything wrong. We just drifted apart, and I was grateful that she was in support of my PhD. There was moments in our relationship where I was willing to just give it up to be with her, make her happy, but she knew the man that I am, and she would never be content knowing that she was the reason why that happened. And
Mhm.
to this day, I'm super grateful because even after we split and it was a rough couple of months, going back to the beginning of the podcast when we talk about strength, right? Mental strength. I was lucky enough to have such a great support system around me to motivate me, right, and to push me. And in a sense, there's this expectation of your colleagues that they kind of see you at this standard, right? Dr. Baker cracked me up because she would show her students, my CV is like, this is what a CV PhD student should look like. To me, I'm like, I don't know, but cool, thanks, right? But you know, uh, there was times when people, would say, you do a lot. How do you do it? And I'm just like, I don't know, but if I don't have friends that support me, there's no way I could have got this done. And there was countless times where you and I would have conversations about things, and um, you're right. There was a point where I just didn't want to do it anymore. I was burnt out, but I think that has to do with just you're in the moment, right? You're wrestling with Khabib. He's taking you to the trenches. You're just trying to breathe, and then eventually you win, and you're like, oh my god, I did that. I survived. There were some casualties along the way, um, but I'm happy. I did it, and I think I'm stronger mentally, physically. I'm definitely a lot stronger than I was before. um, and so, if there's any advice, and I'm sure a lot of social influencers talk about this too, um, is I won't say it gets easier, right? But I will say, if you ever to like grit your teeth and just keep walking forward, eventually you'll finish. Right, you'll get to the finish line. Um, and I do believe it takes a very special person to do a good job finishing their PhD. You can get a PhD. There are plenty of people with PhDs. I'm like, I don't know how you got a PhD, but you have one.
Yeah.
Congrats. I'm not taking anything from you. But to do a PhD and do it really well, right? You should be able to come out of that PhD and like be self sufficient, right? Run your own lab, do your own studies. People should be able to come to you and ask questions, and you should be able to, for the most part, answer them. Um, and I came out of there, hands held high, Breakfast Cup style. Just I was lucky, and a lot of that had to do with the friends, the mentorship, and then the mental fortitude. Even when things were dark, and they were dark, not like dark where people were like concerned about me, but just dark in the sense of like I'm normally a very cheerful person.
Yeah.
There's not a day where I'm not smiling and just being goofy. Um, but there was moments where I'm just like, man, I don't have it in me anymore to like keep doing this PhD. Like this is rough. But we're here, so I
Yeah.
made it.
Yeah. Yeah. Does doing hard things and this desire to be great at the things that you do come at a price, and is that price worth it?
Man, that's a loaded question, Tony. I don't know. I will say it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Um, like I said before, I'm all about trying to be the best version that I can be. Um, and I joke around, I got the PhD, but what did it cost me? My relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
I joke around, and it's a serious matter because you hear some people that finish their PhDs and they're in a relationship and there's hardship. My advisor, I laugh because we have such a similar like history. The first time I met him, he told me about his divorce. I don't know if he told you about his divorce, but he was like, there was times where he would check his phone and it would say that work was home and home was work because he spent more time in the lab than he did at home,
Yeah.
right? And same thing for me. I was more at the lab than I was home, and it costs my relationship. So it's definitely tough. And there was times where even with my parents, I was just very irritable because I'm like, why are you calling me right now? Like I'm in the middle of work,
Yeah.
right? And it's your parents, there's no reason for you to feel that way. Um, but that was such a small like moment. And the double-edged sword of that, or the other side of that is, yeah, you did what you needed to do, but like for instance, myself, I'm never satisfied, right? I can always do better. Um, and so if I can find someone that's okay with knowing that I'm always going to want to be the best, right? It's fine. But I think that's the hard part is some people don't have that. They don't have that dog in them, right? So they can find that kind of intimidating, or maybe they need more attention than you're willing to give. And for me, it's just like, well, I'm in the peak of my career, and this is what I really want to focus on.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so it just depends, right? Do you want to be in a happy, healthy relationship? And it's not to say you can't do both, right? But as I said before, I had pretty bad work life balance, and I'm getting better at it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think the disconnect for a lot of people comes with this idea that you want to be the best at the thing that serves you, which is your career, and they see that and they think, well, why can't you want to be the best at relationships? And are you going to be the best at being a father, being a husband? Like, where do you draw that line of like, can you be the best at everything? Or are you, when you say you want to be the best, you're only talking about your career and that trajectory, as opposed to being the best version of yourself in all capacities of life? Are you the best friend you can be? Are you the best partner you can be? Or is it specifically, are you the best researcher? And I think defining those roles of what that means to you and being upfront and honest about it is the thing that's going to cultivate the relationship that best suits you as the person. But you have to understand those things. You have to think about those things and understand who you are. Um, One of the things you touched on a lot was mentorship. Um, what what makes a great mentor to you?
Ooh, man, hitting home. I think what makes a good mentor is someone that is obviously going to be there for you, right? Not only from like an academic perspective, but also from like a personal relationship. Um, I remember it's funny that I have these ways of just like not wanting to do research and research and stuff. But I remember during my master's, I was meeting with my my advisor at the time, and I was like in tears because I was just like, I can't do this. Like this is a lot. Like I was just everything up until that point has come easy to me in life. Right, playing sports, school, it's been easy. And so for the first time in my life, I was being challenged and really challenged. Right. Um, but he was able to be empathetic and listen. Because I think a lot of times too, sometimes when you meet someone and you're kind of expressing your feelings, they kind of downplay it a little bit. Like, well, I
Mhm.
can, if I did it, you can do it,
Yep.
And I think that mentality is silly because people deal with things differently. But he was able to be there. And then when he saw I was struggling, he would come up to me and say, "Hey, what can I do to help?" And I was like, "Well, I'm doing data collection right now, but I need to be recruiting and I can't do both at the same time." He said, "Say less." So he would actually go to Publix with one of the other professors and they would just hand out study flyers,
Yeah. Amazing.
right? And, he would sit down with me and talk to me and be like, "Now, Alex." And so it was a lot of like being present, right? Being direct and not sugarcoating things, but being like mindful that I'm in this fragile state of I don't know what I'm going to do in my life, and I'm kind of relying on you to kind of guide me. And so having to have a mentor that can do that, I'm not saying they have to hold your hand by any means, but when you reach out your hand for help, they're willing to grab your hand, and guide you. And I think there's also different types of mentorship, right? There's mentorships within friends, right? Um, in academia, yes, you have your advisor, but I can't tell you how many times I went to Dr. DeFreitas or Dr. Baker or anyone else in the department and asked a question that my advisor doesn't have an answer to.
Yeah.
And I think a good mentor is knowing that you have limitations yourself, right?
Yeah.
You can't know everything and be everything. Sometimes you have to rely on other people to help in areas that you lack in. And so if you have a mentor that's not willing to guide you in the right direction, then I don't think that's the mentor for you. Because I feel like the most success I've ever had was because I had good mentorship.
Yeah. No, I agree. And everything you said resonates very, very close to home. And now that you're embarking on being your own mentor, right? I think it's important to understand the qualities that you wanted out of a mentor. Are you able to bring those same qualities to your group, and just continuing to contemplate that idea of like, am I living up to the expectations that I have for myself and the expectations that my students have for me, my research assistants and all that stuff, and constantly evaluating that on a weekly basis. Like, am I living up to those expectations? Because it can be very easy to fall into the trap of like, yeah, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And in your reality, that is the case. But in the reality of your students and your mentees, they're like, this guy's been checked out for months, you know? So I think there is that constant like evaluation process that you have to go through. And it'll be fun talking to you about how you're refining that, how you're getting the best out of yourself and out of your students as you progress through your first year and you begin to do your research that you have coming up this next semester. Um, One thing that I know about you is anime plays a big role in your life, right? What,
Yes, very
what,
true.
what, what does anime do for you? What does it give you? What is it, just something where you can check out, or does it give you more than that? Like what is anime, what part does that play in your life?
Oh man, this is like the coolest question someone can ask me. Um, well, like I said before in the beginning of this podcast, Hajime no Ippo, which is my favorite anime of all time, right, has to deal with this kid that when it just got bullied, became a champion, boxing champion in Japan. And I mean, I remember watching Dragon Ball Z as a kid, right? The power ups, the screaming, the fighting, right, and like pushing yourself past your limits. And so for anime, for me, right, it's kind of a two things. It's inspiration in a sense, right? Because a lot of these protagonists in these shows are these nobodies that overcame adversity, overcame challenges, overcame, so many things. When everyone counted them out, the cool theme song starts to play, they're rising up. And I can't tell you how many times I rewinded certain points of an episode because I was just like, damn, that's that's what I want, right? And then there's times when you kind of just watch anime just to laugh and chuckle. But majority of the time when I do watch anime, there's really good plot. Um, and the character development really resonates with me. Um, so for instance, I actually my two favorite animes I got tattoos over this year because I was just like I have to do it. I have the Transmutation Circle from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and in this show is two brothers who essentially lost their body to alchemy, right? The idea of equivalent exchange. And so the whole time they're essentially trying to find what's known as the Philosopher's Stone to basically get their bodies back. And so they go through this whole journey, and sometimes they hated each other and love each other. And it was some moments when you're just there crying because you're just like, what? And at the end, you're like, man, that was awesome. Like I think we all want to embark on a journey. And when we look back, we're like, I did everything I wanted to do. I did the best that I could do. I have no regrets. And now you're like, you're living the life you want to live. Right. And there's animes where they end and you're like, what? Like, okay, cool, sure. And so for me, anime is, I think it's funny because it's me in a sense. Like I think anime is a big part of my life because in a way, there's a lot of mentorship,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? Like you're not necessarily there, but like when someone's talking, they're saying an inspirational quote or a monologue, you're like, he's talking to me or she's talking to me. I know they are. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's. I think what best describes my geeky side of things and nerdy side of things is, and also really motivated me to want to be stronger and keep getting better.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
a question, man.
Yeah, yeah. There's an emotional connection, right? The hero's journey that Joseph Campbell talks about, this mythology that has stood the test of time of, the you're born and you have life circumstances to overcome. So this journey, this path that you're on, this hero's journey is something that everyone has to deal with, right? And anime, I would have to assume, never watched it, but I'd have to assume that that journey is prevalent within that dynamic, and that emotional connection that you get by watching it is a real thing. I grew up with my dad watching the Rocky, uh, all five of the Rockies, and we watch them all the time. He loved Rocky. He wanted to name my older brother Rocky. My mom said no, absolutely not. But just a couple weeks ago, I was in Philly, and I had the opportunity to run from where I was at to the Rocky statue and run up the stairs that Rocky did. And there was emotions that I just didn't think that I would feel doing that, right? That
Hmm.
connection of his journey, of what he overcame, doing that with my father, and then running those steps, the same steps that he did, going to see a statue. There was something special about that. And it feels like you get something very similar through anime. And I think that's awesome. I think that's very special to find those things in life that can make you feel that way, and also makes you feel like you're being heard and talked to at the same time with inanimate objects or characters that, you know, I think that's what's special about religion. I think that's what's special about all these things, right? The intimate connection that we can build with that stuff is great. And you found that in anime. And I think that's awesome. I think that's also a great way to combat some of the um, I would say melancholy that you can get from doing research all the time, like having that to go back to fall back on. I think that that can also be very special. You also do Dungeons and Dragons. You do all this stuff that allows you to have this creative expression in a world that you've designed to be analytical in nature, right? And I think for me, that's poetry, and that's um, that type of stuff, right? You have to have this creative outlet that allows you to be the truest version of yourself. For you, that's this goofy, uplifting, very happy-go-lucky person that's striving to be the best. And I think the things that you put into your life showcase that quite genuinely, which is great. I think it's awesome. Um, Never gotten into it, but I respect it. I like it. I like it. So, just to wrap this up, I know that you're in your first year as a professor. You have four students that you're mentoring. You're starting your first research project for your professorship next semester. Can you talk about the project? And also, if not, that's fine. And then, are you looking for students in fall of 2025 if they want to go to your lab?
Yeah. So uh, the university, or at least the program, is undergraduates only. So I won't be able to take on any grad students, unfortunately. Hopefully, maybe one day. But if you were in high school and you come across this podcast and you're like, hey, I want to work with this guy, he seems to be doing fun stuff. For sure. I work at Christopher Newport University here in Newport News, Virginia. But some of the projects we'll be working on, I'm still waiting on some equipment at the moment, so we can't do anything too fun, or at least what I think is fun. But one of the first studies, a very simple study, we were essentially going to look at the um, somewhat of reliability of the ultrasound during a fasted and fed state. So basically, they would come in fasted. We'll do ultrasound scans. We'll give them a standardized meal, wait 30 minutes for them to digest it essentially, and then do a scan again. And then 6 hours later, they go do their own thing and they come back, and then we'll do the scans again. And so the idea is, does it really matter if you do ultrasound scans, whether they're fasted, fed, or the time of day, right? Because obviously, when you do research, you kind of want to make sure that the participants are coming at the same time for each visit,
Mhm.
right? For various reasons. And so, one of the follow up studies we wanted to do was actually go to the local powerlifting gym and measure CSA and try to correlate that with strength,
Mhm.
right? In like really strong individuals. And so the idea would be to eventually do longitudinal data collection where every 2 months we'll come back, do a scan, do a 1RM, and see if the change in CSA or muscle size is correlated with the change in strength in strong people. Now, that's not the most appropriate way of doing things. Typically, you want it in a nice, controlled, environment when they come to the lab and everything. But I think there's something cool about going to the gym where they're having the camaraderie of everyone that could potentially influence the data. Sure, but um, I wanted to see with this fasted versus fed state ultrasound if it really matters when I do the ultrasounds, first and foremost. And we wanted to do that in trained and untrained males and females. And so potentially what could happen is if you have a trained individual who is fasted for, let's say, 8 to 10 hours, maybe most likely eight, that their glycogen storages could be, I want to say depleted, right? Chances are they're not depleted, especially if they
Diminished
ate the
though.
day before,
Yeah.
right? But there is a potential that the water content might be diminished, and that might impact right muscle CSA, or the what we call the echo intensity, which is the quality of the muscle. So the darker the image that you trace from that scan indicates that the majority of the muscle is, or the image is muscle, right? Um, and so we know that water content can play a factor with CSA. So we wanted to see if, when you do your scans, should they come in fasted? And if they do you want to make sure they're fasted, or does it not matter if they're fasted or fed or doing some type of physical activity throughout the day? All right. So it's a pretty straightforward study. I think it'd be fun,
Yeah.
especially with people that my students have never done research before, let alone ever seen an ultrasound done on the muscle. But I think it's one of the nice, easy. Before I get everything that I'm like, all right, this is what we're gonna do. 5 visits, 20 different conditions,
Yeah.
sensors everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
No, that's awesome, man. I think you're right. I think that's a great first study to not only get your feet wet, but get the undergraduates some um, research time and understand the dynamics of what research is, recruitment, all that stuff, how to interact. I think that's one of the things that anybody that works under you is going to truly appreciate is the interaction with the subjects and how meaningful and special that is, so that they have a good time in your lab. That's one of the things that you're special at, and you do really well. So I think that'll be a great thing for them to observe and learn. And yeah, like I said earlier, man, like you've taught me the most during the PhD program as far as how to use equipment, how to troubleshoot, how to navigate the circumstances of a PhD. So I'm very thankful for that. I'm very thankful. And yeah, watching you interact with everyone, help everyone, has definitely made me want to become better at the things that I'm doing as well, and interact. And you definitely show a level of what's attainable, and being a good person while obtaining those things. So thank you for the work that you do, and I'm looking forward to the work that you continue to do.
thank you for the kind words. I look forward to seeing you defend your dissertation. You got what, a year left?
A year and a half, yeah.
Oh man, time flies.
Time flies, man. Yeah, no, I appreciate your time, Alex. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you, buddy.